needs a little introduction. Jeremy Boudreau, the head of the History of Art program here at the Institute, who many of you have listened to on numerous occasions on various subjects. And tonight he's going to tell us something about Donatello, the sculptor, not the Ninja Turtle.
Thank you, Simon. Well, I'm mortified. I prepared an hour talk on the Ninja Turtles. I'll see if I can grab some of this Renaissance stuff out of the back of my head to take a look at an artist who has a special day today. And those of you who are familiar with the Institute and our cultural program know that Simon asks me to come in to contribute a talk every once in a while. Sometimes it's in the autumn, sometimes it's in the spring. Depending on where I find myself in the program, I tend to first, before even thinking of a topic, look at that date to see if it has any relevance to the material that we typically cover in our history of art courses. In this day in history, there are a lot of birthdays. The further back you go in history, it is typically difficult to find birthdays of artists, even figures like Donatello, who was born in the 1380s and lived into the 1460s. We have no birthday. For artists like this, it's common to find documents that are dated with statements such as, I, Donatello, in the age of 25, and then we do the math and we sort of establish or determine a year of birth at least. But we don't have so many birthdays when it comes to these great Renaissance artists. And so to compensate for that, what you'll see here in Florence is we have absolutely no problem whatsoever in celebrating the death day of our beloved historic Florentines. And today, the 13th of December, happens to be the day in the year 1466 when Donatello died. So this was the date of the program that the universe assigned to me, and therefore Donatello is the topic of the talk tonight. And Donatello was in the news recently, in the last couple of years, if you like, because of the object which you can see partly represented here in the detail of the title slide. Let's open that up. Take a look at the full terracotta relief sculpture known as the Madonna di Via Pietrapiana, which was purchased in 2001 by the Italian state to add to its collections of cultural patrimony from a strange collection of owners, an actual condominium, a residential building here in the city of Florence, was collectively the proper owner of this work. Following its attribution to Donatello in the late 1980s, the work was removed from its external tabernacle, restored, placed in a vault, and sort of years down the road, we finally come to the sale, the purchase, and the inclusion of this work of art, not only in the recent Donatello exhibition, which was housed at the Palazzo Strozzi and the Bargello Sculpture Museum, but is now on permanent display within the collection of the Bargello. So I want to start off with this object, sort of use this as the focus of the talk tonight, in order to understand why Donatello is so sought after, even after all of this time, even by institutions here in Florence who already claim the lion's share of works attributed to Donatello. I can think of 1,000 other places that need a Donatello more urgently than the Bargello, but this is where it's ended up, right? So let's break this down, and then what we can do is try to understand how this work factors into the corpus of works attributed to Donatello, as well as some of the problems that arise when it comes to attributing works like this in modern times to historic artists. Let's first of all look at the title of this work of art. The Madonna di Via Pietrapiana takes its name from the location where it was originally installed in an external corner tabernacle. And like many Renaissance artists, Donatello was the author of many versions of this particular subject, the Madonna and Child. In order to distinguish them from one another, we typically give them names that have to do either with their original locations, their original patrons, perhaps modern purchasers of these works of art that then bequest the works to museums. So if you've ever heard of the Pio Madonna or the Shaw Madonna, these are just examples of objects that take their names from owners within the provenance of these works of art in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Via Pietrapiana is actually the name of the street on which this object was found for many years. And the tabernacle, for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, hopefully you'll appreciate these images. you can't get to Florence anytime soon, this is what the street corner looks like here, with the tabernacle just above eye level, and a better view of the work as it appeared before its restoration here. If you're familiar with the city of Florence, the Via Pietrapiana is found in the area heading away from the Piazza Salvemini and the Posta Nuova. If you are making your way towards the Piazza Ciompi or the Church of Sant'Ambrogio, you would likely pass by this corner without even thinking to look up at this tabernacle. We've got tabernacles in every corner in a place like Florence, so it's easy to pass by these things without noticing them. The work was there, at least since the 19th century, and it had been referenced by early Donatello scholars following the important centenary exhibition of his works that was arranged here in Florence in the year 1886. So we know we've got lots of works of art that are attributed to Donatello, attributed either to his circle, his workshop, his influence, more loosely, and they've been sort of here forever. This work had been basically sort of left alone right up until this attribution to Donatello himself. And when the sale was finalized, again, now the permanent home of the work will not be so far from its original location here in Florence. We're not talking about, Detroit. We're talking about the Bargello Museum, which is about 500 meters away from the intersection on which the Madonna was originally installed. Here you can see a photograph of the exhibition of the object together with other works in the Corpus of Donatello in the ground floor spaces of the Bargello Museum. This was the way that the work was installed for the Donatello exhibition, which we had here in Florence last year, before moving on with most of the works on view here in Florence to the V&A in London. And here is a view that gives you an idea of how they have chosen to display this work now in the Bargello upstairs in the large Sala Donatello, together with several reliefs depicting the Madonna and Child, carved in marble, cast in glazed terracotta, unfired terracotta, by members of the generation of Florentine artists that we associate with Donatello, including the Della Robbia workshop and others. So we've got a nice addition, let's say, to a small grouping of Madonna and Childs that we find in the Bargello. But I want to come back to a point that I made at the beginning of the talk, like why does the Bargello, of all places, need another one of these Donatello, Madonna, and Childs? Was this a particularly prestigious work, as it was described by the primary sources? Was this a work that belonged to a particular individual that's significant historically for the city of Florence? None of this really factors in with this particular object, the Madonna di Via Pietrapiana. And in fact, if we consult the sort of official biography provided by Vasari just under a century after the death of the artist himself, we find no mention of this Madonna and Child specifically. And this is something that we have to appreciate when it comes to valuing Donatello and valuing the works of Donatello. Much of the celebrity visited on this artist came to shape in the century following his death, particularly in the writing of figures like Vasari and his contemporaries in the 16th century. We have something of a mythology constructed around Donatello. And in fact, if we take a look at the portrait of Donatello included in this cartouche in an early publication of Vasari's Lives of the Artists, it is obviously the same rendering or likeness used to represent Donatello, we believe, in this puzzling and enigmatic object in the collections of the Louvre in Paris. This group portrait of illustrious Florentines whose identifications have been challenged despite their inclusion on the frame. Beneath these portrait busts, we have, I hope that you can see that here in the room, Giotto, Paolo Uccello, Donatello, Antonio Manetti, and Filippo Brunelleschi. It has been suggested that these are identifications that were added to the work of art long after its initial creation and are therefore potentially erroneous. It's been suggested that the figure often identified as Giotto is in fact a portrait of the 15th century mathematician Antonio Manetti, and the young beardless fellow positioned between Donatello and Brunelleschi is a portrait of the young Masaccio. We'll never know, but the idea that we've got Donatello sort of dead center here in this arrangement of figures, the idea that we've got something of a connection to very important artists, including Brunelleschi, Paolo Uccello, Masaccio himself. This helps to secure something of a place for Donatello within this celebrated era of the early Renaissance. I want to talk to you today about what we know, first of all, about Donatello, who those figures were in his network, try to survey briefly, as briefly as possible, the major output of the artist during his life here in Florence, as well as in other Italian cities, and then come back to focus on this production of Madonna and Child. So what do we know about Donatello? Born Donato di Niccolò di Betto Bardi here in Florence in the year 1386, dying, as I had said, on this day in the year 1466. You might recognize the surname included here in his official identification, Bardi, as an important noble Florentine family. This is not the family who gives us the wonderful decorations of their family chapel at Santa Croce by the hand of Giotto back before the plague. If he is related to that line of the famous Bardi bankers of Florence, it is very much distant. However, the fact that Bardi is part of his name probably works to his advantage, both during his living career, as well as for historians who are hopefully trying to sort of elevate the status of this figure following his death. He was patroned throughout his career by Piero de' Medici, whose wife, Contessina de' Bardi, for example, is part of this important Florentine family. The relation to Donatello is, if anything, certainly distant. However, they're going to sort of sweep that under the rug because to be a Bardi is better than not being a Bardi. So we've got something of an idea in some of the sort of more superficial summaries of his character. That is this sort of noble birth, let's say, or this high-class birth that gives something of a sophistication to Donatello in terms of his interactions with patrons and other artists. We know, for example, that he did study as an apprentice within the workshop of Lorenzo Ghiberti here in Florence. This is the only sort of documented teacher that we have to speak of regarding the early career of Donatello. His collaborators, starting from early off, just out after his matriculation out of the Ghiberti workshop, include his lifelong friend, Filippo Brunelleschi, Nicolosi di Bartolomeo, Nanni di Banco, the Sienese Jacopo della Quercia, as well as Luca della Robbia and his family army of ceramicists. These are all figures who are going to interact with Donatello throughout his career. They're going to collaborate on works, including funerary monuments, the decorations of religious spaces, including sacristies, chapels, baptistries, as well as, in some cases, we will see small devotional objects intended for typically the domestic setting, works of art that could be positioned within the home, used for private devotion, typically these small format Madonna and Child. What was his impact or his influence when it comes to distinguishing the Donatello Madonna and Child from all of the other Madonna and Child? What are the names that are floating around when people are trying to identify whether or not a work arrives close to the hand of Donatello? Is this someone who saw a Donatello once in his life and tried really hard to remember what that looked like? Is this someone that really was raised with an education within the workshop of Donatello and had a very intimate connection to the artistic output of this artist? This is the sort of the scale that we try to use to understand the circle of the workshop of, etc. Who are those figures? I would argue that very few of these names would be recognizable to a general audience. Bartolomeo Bellino, Bertoldo di Giovanni. This happens to be the sculptor who was running the Medici Sculpture Gardens at the time that young Michelangelo shows up here in Florence looking for an education. So while we have something of a sort of gap left between the death of Donatello in 1466 and the birth of Michelangelo in 1475, it's really Bertoldo di Giovanni that's that missing link, sort of communicating what he learned from Donatello to the young Michelangelo. Desideri da Settignano, Maso di Bartolomeo, Palma di Lapo Cortigiani, and Silvestro da Simona, just to name a few of the artists whose names can be found in the documents connected to various projects executed by Donatello. Not only here in Florence, as I had mentioned, but throughout all of Italy. He was a well-traveled artist in demand, traveling to the north, to the south, as far north as Venice, as far south as Naples. and producing works all along the way. Despite this extraordinary career and the mileage accumulated by this artist in his long, productive life, 90% of these works of art are still here in the city of Florence. He's a Florentine. He's coming back to Florence throughout his career, and even a short-term stay in the city of Florence offers access to a number of Donatello artworks that is simply beyond comparison. No other city in the world has this sort of cultural holding. You can find Donatello at the Bargello, of course. You can find Donatello at San Michele, at the Palazzo Vecchio, in the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce, and the Church of San Lorenzo. You can find works of art in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, which is the custodian of objects originally created for the decoration of the baptistry, the cathedral itself, the bell tower. They have recently reconstructed the original Arnolfo facade, in which an early Donatello is on permanent view. That's the St. John the Evangelist. So just coming to Florence for a week, you could technically get to all of these places and see the largest number of Donatellos available in any other city. What do we know from the early sources about Donatello in terms of his personality, his interactions with artists early on in his training or his career? When we consult the biography of Vasari, he gives us some information which is a bit misleading. Vasari would have us believe that Donatello, who was born, as I had said, to this member of a Bardi family in Florence, was actually a member of the Wool Carters Guild. So, not a banker, but someone who was a merchant established with the business here in Florence. He worked here as well as in the smaller cities, in the outskirts of Florence, the smaller communes within the Florentine state at the time. And we hear from Vasari that it would be in the house of the Martelli in Florence that the young Donatello is handed over as a gifted young child showing perhaps intellectual promise. He's taught to read, use the abacus, all of this, receiving something of a private education within the household of the Martelli. This is why it's not so incidental. Those of you who were able to join us for the talk delivered by Paolo D'Agostino, talking about the consortium or the polo of museums, the Bargello, the Casa Martelli, the Medici Chapels, etc. Why are they sort of linking these places together? This idea that the Martelli are something of an early sort of foster family for Donatello has given rise to some confusion. Now, he certainly did work for the Martelli family later in his career, providing also a sarcophagus for the family tomb in the Church of San Lorenzo. But it is this sort of idea that he was sort of already there as a child that led scholars to attribute this work of art found in Washington, D.C. today to Donatello. It has been variously attributed to Benedetto da Maiano, other Florentine sculptors. I think it's sort of a question mark on the label today. But the reason this is known as the David of the Casa Martelli is because a version of the sculpture, at least, appears in a painted portrait of a later member of the family that was painted by Bronzino in the 16th century. So basically what we're seeing here is supposedly the, I find my mouse, it's gone. What we're seeing here is supposedly the original installation of this work, I believe, within the interior courtyard of the Casa Martelli. So we have this idea that, thanks to the Martelli, we've got a young Donatello ready to go out into the workforce. We don't think that this is so much the case now. If he had any interactions with the Martelli as a child, they would have been very brief. In fact, the first information that we have regarding Donatello as a youth actually comes in the form of a government record in the nearby city of Pistoia. Pistoia, if you've ever had a chance to visit, a beautiful town. Here is the cathedral dedicated to Saint Zeno, which receives additional importance in the Middle Ages following the arrival of relics of Saint James from the Church of Santiago de Compostela. So this is sort of a twin dedication today to the saints Zeno and James. And in this town, in the government records of Pistoia, we learned that there was an altercation in the square on a day when Donatello's father had business in Pistoia and brought his young son along with him. Donatello should be about 15 years old at the time. That apparently he got into a brawl with another adolescent of German descent that went on to such an extent that the unfortunate foreigner drew blood, sort of bleeding from being hit with a stick by Donatello. So we've got something of an early document, which is not too reassuring, in terms of this sort of great networking, artist getting along great with all of his patrons and his collaborators. It seems like he had a temper as a child. And we've got this sort of strange, isolated document that seems to suggest that he was reprimanded or punished for violence in the streets of Pistoia. If he was there, and this is in fact the Donatello, it was likely in this same instance that he was able to encounter the young Brunelleschi, who was one of his earliest projects, was working on the completion of an important art found in the cathedral at Pistoia, which I'm showing you here. This is, again, a work that had, like many of these arts and treasuries, had been begun in the Middle Ages and is sort of being finished off in the last years of the 1300s, once the dust has settled from the plague. And there are two small prophet figures here that are by the hand of a young Filippo Brunelleschi. So it's perhaps here in Pistoia that the young Donatello, who is 10 years younger than Brunelleschi, encounters this, what will eventually become a great important sculptor and architect, but who is also just sort of getting started. He's at the outset of his career himself. I can't help but notice some of the similarities between these early works of Brunelleschi and the early works of Donatello, including one of his earliest life-size seated statues, that representation of St. John the Evangelist, which is on display in the reconstructed facade of the cathedral at the Opera Museum. So we've got something of a connection established already between Donatello and Brunelleschi, perhaps even before the year 1400. And if you've heard of Brunelleschi before, chances are you've heard of his rise to fame via a sort of an ill-fated competition in which he applied to receive an important commission here in the city of Florence that was given to his great rival, Lorenzo Ghiberti. Of course, talking about the baptistry doors competition for the second set of bronze doors to be cast for the Florentine baptistry. A call for artists is made by the cathedral board. I believe there are 7 original competitors who are each given tablets of bronze and asked to produce a relief in bronze contained within the format of a quatrefoil frame representing the Old Testament theme of the sacrifice of Isaac. The 2 finalists, Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi, sort of gone down in history as sort of the great rivals who are vying against one another to receive this commission. We know that the commission is given to Ghiberti, and in the sort of aftermath of not being selected to begin this important project in the city of Florence. And let's just to give us an idea of what kind of job these applicants were hoping for. The dates that you normally encounter when you consult the attribution for the first set of Ghiberti's doors, the second gates of the baptistry, date from 1402 to 1424, decades of work. So this is what Brunelleschi did not receive when he is sort of passed over with the choice of Ghiberti. But Vasari delights in telling us that we should not be unhappy about this, because if Brunelleschi had been set on those doors, he never would have been able to travel to the city of Rome, together with his friend Donatello, who in these years, the first years of the 1400s, following the baptistry door competition, traveled to Rome together. They spend over a year there. They are examining the monuments of the ancient city, some of the collections of antiquities housed by private Roman citizens at the time, looking obviously at what we can see today, monuments like the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Aurelian Walls, the aqueducts, all these sorts of things, but also looking very closely at sculpture, which is still found at this time on the exteriors of many of these ruined monuments. So it will be this sort of exposure to the classicism of the ruins of ancient Rome that inspire both Donatello and Brunelleschi to infuse something of an ancient look and style into works of art produced by themselves to meet the demands of what is sort of normally at this time kind of religiously motivated works of art. Take a look, for example, at the famous wooden crucifix of Donatello, which can be found in a family chapel at the Church of Santa Croce. Fortunately, it's not very easy to get to during the normal visiting hours of the church, but every once in a while they move it and put it on better display. You can notice here that the arms of the figure of Christ on the cross are hinged. This work can be sort of detached and removed, repositioned as well. And Vasari has an anecdote regarding this crucifix. He said that when this was unveiled, this incredible pathos that was communicated through this figure of Christ was perceived by some of its earliest viewers. I don't know if there's an unveiling, but some of the first sort of figures to look at this work and talk about it and write about it said that it was lacking a decorum that they felt was necessary for something like the representation of the Passion of the Son of God. It looks as if Donatello placed a peasant on the cross. This is sort of a phrase that goes down in history, that this was inappropriate as a representation of God or of Christ's crucifixion. He looks too regular, too everyday, too sort of human to really sort of succeed in the function of this devotional object. But this is one example of the experimentation with infusing classicism into a work of art that is primarily intended to meet the demands of a patron. Right? I'm not making these things of my own regard and then putting them up on the wall of my shop and hoping someone stops in today to buy one. I'm waiting for someone to come to me to say, I want one of these. It's got to be this big. It's got to be made out of this material. I'm willing to pay this much for it. And I try to produce whatever I can, based on the guidelines and the criteria of that commission. So all of these artists are trying to experiment with these new ways of communicating antique style through religious works of art, also through civics works of art. And this is not exclusive, of course, to Donatello or to Brunelleschi. One of their contemporaries, Nanni di Banco, who was the author of the Quattro Coronati, the patron saints of the Stone Carvers Guild, is a great example. If you walk by this niche at Or San Michele here in Florence, you can see that the predella relief, this base relief beneath the niche, has a lovely portrait of the members of the guild that commissioned these statues of their patron saints. But looking up at the patron saints themselves, who are not identified as specific individual saints, but as something of an anonymous grouping of early Christian sculptors who met their end following their refusal to carve an effigy figure of the Roman emperor, as it went against their commitment to God. So something of an early example of artistic martyrdom. These are these legendary ancient carvers who were sort of adopted as the protectors of the Stone Guild. And when we look up at the portraits of those saints, they look like they're ancient philosophers. If you've ever been to those endless corridors of the Vatican museums, we've got busts and busts and busts and busts. It sort of looks as if someone's taken some of those ancient statues out of the Vatican and put them here into this Gothic niche in Or San Michele in Florence. And when we look at other objects that are connected to Nanni di Banco, including this head, which is found in the Cathedral Museum at Pisa, here is a literal fragment of an antiquity, a bust portrait of Antinous that had been worked on by the artist in the early 15th century. So in many cases, they are taking actual antiquities, modifying them, using them to practice, to study, in some cases repair, in some cases repair and sell off for extraordinary sums of money. And this is something that we have to imagine as part of the current that Donatello is living in. Donatello, as you know, produced several statues for the Or San Michele program himself in the early years of the 1400s, including the St. Mark for the Linen Guild, the statue of St. Louis of Toulouse, which was removed from Or San Michele and relocated at Santa Croce historically, following up the freeing of the niche that this occupied. If you're familiar with the Doubting Thomas sculpture group by Andrea del Verrocchio, that niche is where this St. Louis of Toulouse originally was installed. We also, of course, have the great celebrated St. George, whose predella is also one of the great milestones within the sort of rebirth of the arts in the 15th century for its particularly convincing perspectival relief. So let's take a look at him for a second, first of all, our great St. George. Just to remind you that even when it comes to something like the physiognomy, the hairstyle, there's something, I think, simultaneously evocative of the medieval knight of chivalry, but also something of the classical soldier of antiquity, kind of fused into this armor that we find representing George. His extraordinary relief, again, in the base showing George rescuing the damsel in distress here from the dragon, is one of the earliest examples of Donatello's relief carving in which this sort of pictorial effect is achieved, not by producing these figures in high relief, but leaving the relief extremely low to the point where it looks almost pressed into the slab of stone itself. And this particular technique, which is instantly popularized by the success of Donatello's own work, is known as rilievo schiacciato, pressed in, right? We sort of get the idea that we're looking more at a painting than at a carving. What I will point out to you here also is that this figure of the damsel in distress, clutching her arms like this with this wonderful, graceful twist to her body and sort of, rippling of these robes kind of around her waist and her legs, is another great example of the sampling of motifs from ancient art being reintroduced into works of art in this time period. Donatello had worked in marble, he had worked in wood, he had been casting in bronze. He also worked in a problematic stone, local here to Florence, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the Pietra Serena, that we can find certain Renaissance works of art carved from. Most importantly, the Marzocco, the lion, the civic lion, the symbol, totem animal of the Florentine Republic, as well as an early Annunciation in the nave of Santa Croce, known as the Cavalcanti Annunciation. And here, just again, this is not the sort of greatest material to carve from, especially if it's left outside in prolonged exposure to the elements. It tends to erode rather quickly. But what I wanted to show you here was a similarity between this representation of the Virgin Mary and the sort of damsel in distress in the lower relief of the St. George image. And both of these figures seem to be connected to a work that was produced by Donatello in 1431, unfortunately now lost, but remembered thanks to its contemporary celebrity. And that was the statue of Plenitude, Abundance, or Dovizia, placed atop a column in the Old Market here in Florence, the area of town which is now known as the Piazza della Repubblica. That work was a carving originally made in Pietra Serena, like the Marzocco, and following years of being up there, sort of exposed to the rain and the hail and everything, it was basically falling to pieces. And in the year 1721, Giambattista Foggini is commissioned to produce a duplicate, not a duplicate, but basically a replacement for this work of art, which I think fell off of the column and smashed to bits. That Foggini is now already replaced with a replacement, and the replacement's in a museum. So time goes by. But even in the 16th century, Piero da Vinci, for example, producing a very similar sculpture for a public space in the city of Pisa, which at this point is under Florentine control, reminding us that this civic sort of presence of Donatello in the public squares, sort of accessible to citywide audiences. Anyone who visits the city of Florence, can look at Donatello. You don't need to be, sort of invited upstairs into Palazzo Medici. I mean, these things are out in public. Sort of look at them. You can celebrate them. And many artists celebrated these works as well. Take a look at the fresco representing the birth of the Virgin, painted by the workshop of Ghirlandaio for the chancel of Santa Maria Novella. Here we've got St. Anne reposing in the bed. We can see the infant Mary here being tended to by midwives. And you can see someone sort of coming in with, I guess, refreshments for mom here, coming in from the door, holding this plate of fruit on her head, looking like some kind of Carmen Miranda figure, dancing across the foreground of the figure with this sort of swoop in the drapery and this wonderful kind of, rippling behind her. This is that sort of nymph figure, that sort of classical female figure that they are using as Madonna, as Dovizia, as the damsel of St. George. It's sort of a beautiful type. It's a beautiful representation of the female figure. And following its reappropriation by Donatello in the form of this Dovizia sculpture, you start getting small, itemized, sort of domestic versions of this. So I don't know, you walk by the souvenir shops here in Florence, and there are a million Davids, different sizes, different colors, a million, Venuses on the half shell, all these sorts of things that you can take home with you. You can put that on your bookshelf. You can get the magnet for your refrigerator. You can get the lawn ornament for your garden, right? You can do all these sorts of things here. Let's imagine that in the Renaissance, Florentines could commission a small, private, personalized Dovizia, like the one that we can see here, which is in New York today, typically produced on high bases so that they could be further personalized with an inscription on the base, depending on who the actual buyer is. This would sort of go on your dining room table. So you've got Donatello sort of in the home. And one thing that I'll point out here is that this sort of technical ability to produce multiple copies, serial casting, especially of works in terracotta, this is another innovation that's really introduced in Donatello's lifetime. Being able to I don't want to say mass produce, but being able to produce multiple versions or copies of a work based on a matrix and multiple castings, this is something which is sort of just coming into common practice, okay? This is going to be an important factor when we get back to the Madonnas. There are copies of Donatello's, there are Donatello's, copies of Donatello's originals, right? There are copies of the copies of Donatello's originals. So you've got this facility of copying, which is also in part explained by the fact that in this period in history, there is no flexible mold. You can't use silicone. If you've ever, like baking, you pop your cupcakes out of the silicone baking mold, we don't have flexible molds like that. So we have to make sure that the relief is composed in a way that you're not going to damage it by trying to take a cast. So this low-lying relief, this rilievo schiacciato, is also ideal for eventual copying, say, okay? So when we look at, again, sort of these collaborations of Donatello, sort of want to go into some of his work focusing around the area of the cathedral, because this is the stuff that we hear in Florence, of course, and just if it's not raining, we can sort of literally walk outside and appreciate these sorts of things. If you take a look here at the north flank of the cathedral, you will notice one of the 7 portals that provide access to the interior of the cathedral has the line of people queuing up to climb Brunelleschi's dome, typically during opening hours. But if you were to look carefully at that portal, which is known as the Porta della Mandorla, it's a beautiful work of art, which is also a collaborative effort. It's the result of a collaboration of several artists in the early 1400s. It's known as the Porta della Mandorla because the representation of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary represents that saint contained within an almond-shaped body halo, mandorla being the Italian word for almond, basically. This is the term that we give to these particular shapes that we find sort of encircling saints. The Porta della Mandorla is largely given over generally to the oversight and direction of Nanni di Banco. However, we will see that the Donatello people, in all of their numbers, go to this door and they look at details very, very closely, because it's also recorded that Donatello provided small elements to the decorative program. And in fact, one of them, which is cited by Hennessy, and by everybody who's writing on Donatello, in the 1970s and 80s, is a small detail here at the very, very bottom of the pinnacled tympanum. And that is a relief, it's a very, very fuzzy enlargement here, but profile figure of a prophet. And people point this out because they say this was Donatello back in 1422. Take a look at that nose. Take a look at that beautifully classicized profile. That reminds me of the Pazzi Madonna in Berlin. That reminds me of the Madonna della Nuvole in Boston. That reminds me of all these profiles that I see later in the works that we are attributing to Donatello. So what do you do when you've got these works of art that have no provenance? You go to the works that have not moved in 600 years. This door has not moved in 600 years. If we have a receipt that says Donatello made that face, we can go to that work of art with a relatively high level of certainty that is in fact what we're looking at. But even within these documented projects, there is still a problem at identifying the style of Donatello because, again, he is collaborating with everybody in this town. The phenomenal wall tomb monument of the anti-pope, John the 23rd, Baldassare Cossa, is found inside of the Florentine baptistry. He rose to power thanks to the auspices of early members of the Medici family, and they commissioned to have this tomb produced for him here in Florence, as he was unable to be entombed in the Vatican grottos. And this is a collaborative effort between Michelozzo di Bartolomeo and Donatello. They will collaborate on several monuments later in Donatello's career. But this is kind of par for the course. When you've got a place like the cathedral complex in Florence, the baptistry and the bell tower and the cathedral and all this other stuff. I mean, you don't have enough artists in the city in terms of a supply to realistically get through the decorative programs that the administrators of this church are hopeful for. Something like the stained glass windows of the drum of the dome, produced by leading figures of the day, but normally the direct contributions are little more than provision of cartoons. This is a badly eroded stained glass window at the cathedral, which was based on cartoons provided by Donatello in the program of moments within the life of the Virgin, his window representing the coronation of Mary as the Queen of Heaven. This is something that he doesn't spend a lot of time on. I would hope that it wouldn't take him like months and months to sort of draw a cartoon for a stained glass window. The window itself took 3 years to actually produce based on the drawings of Donatello. But it's an important object for us because Donatello is not an artist who left a lot of drawings behind. We don't have loads and loads of drawings of Donatello. So here's one example of how his drawing and draftsmanship would have been interpreted by contemporary artists. We also have his contribution to the program of prophets adorning the niches of the Florentine bell tower. Wonderful statues that have been replaced with facsimile today. The originals are all found in the new Museo dell'Opera del Duomo. And the 5 prophets attributed to Donatello, largely because of the presence of autographs, are the ones I'm showing you here. Entering into this museum, not only can you see that early St. John in the reconstructed facade, the prophets in their new display from the bell tower, you can also see works of art related to the interior decoration of the Florentine cathedral, including the 2 choir balconies, or cantorie, authored by Donatello and Luca della Robbia, respectively. So here, again, something of a collaboration now with members of a family who are at the center of this idea of multiple castings. Okay, so yes, they're working in marble, but this is also the family of terracotta. This is the family of multiple copies, multiple versions. Donatello's learning all of that from this generation of artists working in very practical ways. These collaborations continue for the baptistry of the cathedral at Siena, the beautiful baptismal font, which is overseen by Jacopo della Quercia. He invites Lorenzo Ghiberti and Donatello to come down and produce bronze reliefs for the basin of the baptismal font. And here is Donatello's representation of the presentation of the head of the Baptist at the banquet of Herod, following the dance of Salome. So another example of a very low relief, which gives us an extraordinarily convincing illusion of architectural and atmospheric space being incorporated now into Donatello's regular work in casting. Traveling down south, we'll just look very, very quickly at this because it's another object that tends to be referenced by those who are hopeful to offer a new attribution to Donatello. The tomb of the Cardinal Rinaldo Brancacci, which is found in the Church of Sant'Angelo a Nilo in Naples. This is another Michelozzo collaboration project, but one particular detail of this tomb, which is the relief of the Assumption, down here just above the 3 figures at the base, is another extraordinary example of this ability of Donatello to work in a pictorial way, thanks to the invention and mastery of this new rilievo schiacciato technique. Not only do we see here something of multiple depths of field suggested by the overlapping of the limbs of these figures, we also have something of an atmosphere suggested by the very rough, unfinished quality of the negative space found between these figures. So any of these sorts of elements that can be found in a Madonna and Child, they can say, well, look at how this compares to the Niche or San Michele. Look at how this compares to the Brancacci tomb down in Naples. Take a look at how this compares to that little mini microscopic prophet up there in the Fourth Villa Mandala. You know, these are the works that have never moved. These are the works that we can safely attribute to Donatello. A few more just to give you an idea. A ciborium in the Church of St. Peter's, as well as the tomb of the Archdeacon of Aquileia, whose name is escaping me at the moment. I believe it was Giovanni Crivelli, but another sort of opportunity taken by Donatello in a brief sojourn in Rome in the 1430s. He will continue to develop a name for himself following an important commission for the cathedral at Prato. If you're familiar with the external pulpit on the corner of the Cortese Cathedral, it is these wonderful reliefs filled with spittelli that really begin to put Donatello on the map. He is continuing to work alongside his friend, Filippo Brunelleschi, as he advances his own career, largely based here in Florence, with the design of the old sacristy, as we call it today, the sacristy for the Church of San Lorenzo, whose medallions, roundels, if you like, found in the lunettes and the spandrels of the vaulted space, as well as the bronze doors and the sort of figures of saints found in these sort of arches above the doorways, all provided by the Donatello workshop. So here's another great place to go and find Donatello, not only in terms of work that's been in place since its installation, but works of art that show his ability to collaborate with architects, with other artists as well. He is commissioned by Florentines to produce the central figure of our patron saint, John the Baptist, for the Florentine chapel in the Franciscan Church of the Frati in Venice. And this is a work that is one of the few wooden polychromed statues or small figures. This isn't life-size, this is just under life-size, produced by Donatello in the middle of his career. This work was only cleaned in 1974, and following the successful removal of several, 1973, sorry, following the several layers of overpaint successfully being removed, they were able to find the original treatment of the polychrome on the wood, as well as the signature of Donatello that had been completely obscured by overpainting. So sometimes when we clean these things, we get good surprises. We get some bad surprises more often than not. But since the restoration of this work of art and the restoration of the Magdalene here in Florence following the damage of the 1966 flood, this would have given us a new understanding and awareness of the use of wood as a sculptural medium within the Renaissance, and particularly within the corpus of Donatello. Padua is the other great place to go to see the maximum output of Donatello's work in bronze. It is the location not only of his monument to Gattamelata, Honeycat, monument here of a northern condottiere. It is also the location of a extraordinary bronze installation for the high altar of the church dedicated to St. Anthony of Padua. It's not the cathedral of Padua, but the most important church in the town, referred to simply as the Santo, and the bronze crucifix, the bronze figures standing on the altar, as well as the bronze reliefs that go all round the four sides of the altar, were produced by Donatello around mid-century. It's for this reason that we think this sort of very intense period working in large-scale castings was able to provide Donatello with the assurance of his own capabilities and virtuoso skill when it comes to finishing off several ambitious works that had been begun here in Florence. And I don't want to talk about these too much because I know that previous speakers on the cultural program this autumn have really focused on some of these statues of Donatello. But the bronze David for Palazzo Medici, the Judith and Holofernes. The problem with objects like this, yes, they're Donatello's, but the first document that we have related to the David comes from after the death of the artist Donatello and the patron, Piero the Gaudi, Cosimo de' Medici. When was this made? Well, it had been made before he died, obviously, so we can put a sort of a terminus antiquarum of 1466, but when in his career was this work actually made for the Medici? So we've got to basically use the process of, well, it wasn't when he was in Padua, it wasn't when he was in Rome, wasn't when could he have made these works of art? And it seems most likely that it was following his return from Padua that these works were finally cast, let's say, and consigned to the Medici. Later in his life, approaching the end of Donatello's career, we have a trip to Siena, where Donatello is able to produce a beautiful relief of the Madonna and Child, known as the Madonna del Perdono. This was found above the entrance to a chapel in the interior of the cathedral until it was removed to make way for Bernini's chapel of the I forget what, put in later in the 17th century. This is in the Museum of the Opera del Duomo di Siena today, and there is also a facsimile on the exterior of the cathedral itself. And within the chapel of the Baptist inside of the Siena Cathedral is one of the last of the great bronze statues produced by Donatello, this extraordinary representation of the hareskin shirted St. John the Baptist. It will be his final return to Florence, in which his output is given over to the bronze pulpits for the Church of San Lorenzo. And these are sort of extraordinary in their own right, not only if we consider the age of the artist, but also the complexity that this relievo schiacciato has taken on later in his career. It's something of an encyclopedia of sort of scriptural passages represented in these beautiful low reliefs. And it is in part his commitment to the beautification of the Church of San Lorenzo, as well as his connections to the Medici family, that he's entombed in the Church of San Lorenzo. And nowadays, you can typically access the crypt, not only to see some of the objects related to the treasury of the Church of San Lorenzo, there is also the tomb of Cosimo the Elder, and there is the tomb of Donatello, sort of just a few footsteps away from him. And typically what they do, again, we don't know Donatello's birthday, so we have to revert to his death day. And this for sure happened over at San Lorenzo this afternoon. Basically, we go down every year on December 13th to Donatello's tomb to lay a wreath of flowers with all of the sort of pomp and the heralds of the city hall, these public officials, and we sort of acknowledge the greatness of this artist and what he had done for the reputation more generally of the city of Florence during the Renaissance. So this is Donatello, and I'm hoping that that overview, basically the entire talk, gives you something of a rounded off idea of the output, the materials that Donatello worked with, the types of subjects that Donatello was concerned with, and perhaps we can sort of repose the question to ourselves today. Did the Italian government really need to spend €1,200,000 on another Donatello? I would say yes, but I work in the arts. I'd rather see it, in a state collection than in a private collection. It has an ability to sort of quell the sort of extraordinary rising in price and value that these objects typically fetch at auction. With buying private collectors. So there's something of a control of the art market that is in part maintained with healthy active acquisition on the part of state collections and museums. But we've got a million Donatellos over there at the Bargello. And we've got a million versions of this Madonna. So even though I said, people are walking around this, everyone knew that there was a Madonna di Via Pietropianta because going back to the 1800s, copies of this work were made. Many, 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 many copies, right? So here is a stucco version of the terracotta Madonna di Via Pietropianta. Why would we have a stucco of a terracotta? Well, of course, we know that we can take, if reliefs are designed carefully, we can typically take very good casts even without flexible molding. And this was also something that the two individuals were very well aware of. The Florentine art dealer Stefano Bardini, and there they are, yes, and the German art historian and art collector Wilhelm von Bode. So this is not a Bardini object necessarily there on the Via Pietropiana, because we don't have any documents related specifically to that tabernacle or that terracotta within the archives of Stefano Bardini, but we have information regarding other ones, right? And so to take a look at something like this work, which is in the Bode Museum today, taking a look at another work which is in the V&A or some of these other collections, when did they enter into these collections? It seems that all these small Madonna and Child reliefs of Donatello, but also of all of the other great Quattrocento sculptors that people are avidly collecting in this period, they want Donatello, they want Desiderio, they want Benedetto. They want these sort of early Quattrocento Florentine people on their museum walls, right? They want to sort of fill out their collections, make them more comprehensive. So anyone that's got a Donatello, right? And they're looking for them in Vienna, they're looking for them in Berlin, they're looking for them in London, Boston, looking for them in Washington. Everyone needs to get Donatellos. So where there is demand, someone needs to come up with a supply. And this is something that, when you look at another beautiful example of a work that sort of entered into the collection of Quincy Adams Shaw, thanks to the brokerage of Bardini, attributed to Luca della Robbia. This is known as the Madonna di Rovezzano, Rovezzano being the name of the small town that we have here just east of the center. And in the church of, I believe, Sant'Andrea at Rovezzano is the sort of description of the original location of this object. The problem is that we've got a million versions of the Madonna del Rovezzano, including within the photo archives of the Bardini archives themselves, like the gesso. So that's a big problem, especially with terracotta reliefs. We can make copies of these very, very easily. And because of the demand of the art market, because of the loose controls on the exportation of antiquities and cultural patrimony in the decades following unification, we don't have any of those sort of real we don't have any laws with teeth regarding the protection of cultural patrimony until the early 20th century. So where are these objects going? How are they getting out of Italy? How are they ending up in these auction houses, in gallery showrooms in Paris, in Vienna, and everywhere else? A lot of the early historians kind of knew in the background that this was going on. When we look at the early Donatello monographs, these guys don't really spend too much time on the Madonna and Childs because they realize that with these small format objects, very easy to replicate, that these could be either complete fabrications, they could be copies of lost originals, they could be historic copies of originals. There's a whole sort of spectrum of how these things sort of fit in. To give you an idea of how popular Donatello was in particular regarding sort of multiple copies. This is another famous work of Donatello, which is known as the Madonna di Verona. This paper mache version was destroyed during the war. This is an old photograph showing you its similarity to a work that's found in a small street in Verona called Via delle Fogge, together with two angels that seem to have been castings of some of the elements of the Padova altar, if I'm not mistaken. But this work of art was one of the most in-demand versions of Madonna and Child attributed to the workshop of Donatello. And in fact, we have photographs, and I think I'm allowed to show these now. They've been published. Those of you who have been able to listen to Lynn Catterson in this room regarding her research on this matter may be familiar with some of the troubling photographs that come out of the archives here in Florence nowadays. Here's a photograph of that same Berlin version of the Madonna di Verona. And on the reverse of the photograph, imagine holding a photograph up to a window so that you can see the image from the reverse side, tracing out the images of the major elements of the composition and measuring them. So just food for thought, if you want to put this in a frame, you don't need to know the distance between the tip of the nose and the middle finger. Right? Those are measurements for reproduction. So when we look at other versions of this, whether they are in Vienna, whether they're in the V&A, whether they're in the National Gallery, these are the sort of objects that represent the demand, represent the supply, which is created to meet the demands of this particular period of the art market. And people have spun this around, they look at these works of art. Here's one that's in the Bode collection at Berlin before the war, after the war. Take a look at the very thick polychrome on this object, together, unfortunately, with many of the Renaissance works of art from the Berlin collections. They were stored during the war in one of the flak towers outside of the city that caught fire and raged for days. And this was the result. This piece has been entirely reconstructed. Polychromy was impossible, lost forever, but at least the terracotta work itself has been put back together again and restored. But this is what you can do with terracotta. You can sort of find an object like this, turn it into that, and say, oh, look at this Donatello. This looks like a pretty expensive Donatello as well. So this is something that, when we look at the modern Donatello people, they are sort of not really sure how to address this issue of the Madonnas until they come up with sort of a marvelous idea. They say, yes, okay, we understand that there was the reproduction, the copying of works of art. We've got all these duplicates floating around. But there are two works of art that we know for fact to be by Donatello. We're absolutely certain of these attributions. Those are the marble reliefs of the Madonna of the Clouds, or the Shaw Madonna in Boston, as well as the Pazzi Madonna in Berlin. And following the sort of publication of essays and catalogs leading up to the last big Donatello centenary in 1986, they came up with something of a new explanation as to why we can have so many Donatellos sort of floating around out there in the world. Here are the catalogs of the Omaggio di Donatello, which was basically penned out by Paolo Barocchi based on the collections here in Florence, as well as a separate catalog that was made for a exhibition of Donatello works held at the Fortezza Belvedere. There was also a show in Detroit in which we had something of a collection of works exhibited in the United States back in 1986. And this all coinciding with the study of an object that enters into the collection of the V&A, which is known as the Collini Madonna. And basically the Collini Madonna, go back for a minute, it's this strange bronze object which has something of an historical description. We know that the doctor of Donatello, Giovanni Collini from San Miniato sull'Arno, was the doctor of this artist, but he was also an admirer of his work and had elements of this tomb, for example, supplied by the workshop of Donatello. But he also supposedly asked for this tondo relief to be cast. And what they noticed about the work in terms of its front side and its reverse side is that the relief information on the front of the image can be reproduced exactly via the concavity of the reverse side with any kind of soft material. And this is also written about in the memoirs left by Donatello's surgeon, Collini. He says, oh, Donatello made this totally genius Madonna that you can, you can sort of shove glass paste into it basically, and you can make multiples right out of the bat. You can sort of, multiply your Madonnas ad infinitum. And so they actually started doing this in the 70s. They took this work from the V&A and they used it as the matrix basically to produce these glass Madonnas. So now we've got this whole idea that Donatello is not the subject of 19th century forgers and dubious businessmen. He is something of an experimenter and inventor, within his own lifetime. Look what he's doing, this glass, how he's making these reliefs that you can make copies of from the backs. I mean, he is thinking about copies. He's thinking about multiple. Obviously, this is why a work like the Pazzi Madonna, has to be original, because it is a, I want to say a singular work, but also a very popular work. Right? We've got copies of the Pazzi Madonna all over the place. Here's one of my favorites, which is found in a small town just outside of Forlì, called Castrocaro Terme. This is known as the Madonna dei Fiori, and since the 17th century, there has been something of a festival in which this copy of the so-called Pazzi Madonna is processed throughout the streets of the town. So they're saying these are not 19th century artists who are copying Donatello. This is Donatello being fantastically redundant in his own time. And therefore, every single one of these Madonnas are real. We're doubling down on that attribution. The Pazzi Madonna was on the cover of both catalogs, the Italian catalog here in Florence, as well as the catalog for the continuation of the show in London. And this is something that historians of the art market in particular are trying to come to terms with. Where is this copying and duplication going on? Is it happening during the Renaissance? Is it happening in the 19th century? Is it happening somewhere in between? Do we have diagnostic methods that can tell us with absolute scientific certainty the date of the materials used for the production of any of these particular Madonnas? Maybe time will one day allow us to answer these questions definitively. But until that day comes, we can say that we've got our own questionable Madonna of Donatello now in Florence. I won't say it's as sort of revered as the Pazzi Madonna up in Berlin, but adding it to the collection of what we've already got here in Florence, I say that we're doing pretty well in the Donatello department. So once it starts raining, if you're here in Florence, again, you don't even have to go into these places. You can be outside in the squares. You can be, sort of walking along the streets. Take a look into these tabernacles. Take a look at the sculptures that we've got up on the plinths and the columns. There's interesting elements of Florentine history and art everywhere around you in this city. And for those of you who have joined us on Zoom, I hope that you can get back soon in order to take a look at everything we've got here in Florence. And in particular, hopefully, got a chance to visit the Bargello, the latest addition to the Donatello collection. Thank you for your attention, and Merry Christmas, everybody.
Well, Jeremy, thank you very much. What a tour de force was that? And it's so many questions you're opening up towards the end there. And we've had Lynn Callison in the room talking about it before, so some of us are all familiar with this controversy, which is raging.
Yes.
But I'm not going to find a definitive answer.
I just stopped captions. I just stopped doing captions. Is it Donatello? Is it not a Donatello? I'm not really sure.
Who knows? But the bronze David probably is. And a lot of others. Anyhow, as always, we'll now open it up for comments, questions, thoughts from the room. And the rules are, if you want to say something in the room, you put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone so that the Zoomers can hear us. And for those on the Zoom, there's two options. We can now see your thumbnails up on the screen. You can either unmute or maybe share a video and talk to us direct, or equally valid, you can put something on the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. So that's how it works. So does anyone want to come in with a comment? Here we are.
Thank you. Thank you. That was fantastic. Thanks so much. You're talking about the reproductions and everything towards the end, that they were conscious of this industry. At the time, how big was the workshop? Do we know, like, Donatello was, I mean, it must have been a big project.
Donatello is so itinerant throughout his career that he doesn't seem to hold on to the same workshop for very long. It's not like he's got the same, 4 or 5 apprentices who are carrying along with him throughout his career. He has certain assistants that he hires temporarily in Padua, for example, when he's working at Santo. I believe that there are some documents that record him traveling from Florence to other cities with a small number of apprentices. That could also be just helping you, like, move your stuff around. So his workshop is not understood with great certainty over time. Who was there for how much time, even within these other figures, who were studying together under Donatello. That is not so clear. What is clear in terms of the 19th century is that many of the dealers in Italy were equipped with restoration studios, so that works of art that were perhaps found in auctions or demolitions or supplies, these sorts of things could be fixed up before being sold to foreign collectors typically, or their agents and brokers. So this is the problem that who is more likely to be making multiple copies, the Renaissance artists or the people selling their work and making money off of it. This is the question. There's also an excellent history of forgery in 19th century Italy. If we look earlier in the century to figures like Giovanni Bastianini, but even late up, the early 20th century, Alceo de Sena. There's a huge scandal here in Italy in the 1930s where Alceo de Sena comes out saying, I was really gifted at making, Renaissance looking and medieval looking things, and I sold them for like $200 to this guy who was then selling them to collectors in London and Boston and everywhere else, saying that they were original works of art. And I'm here to say, no, I made those myself. So there was something of it, and that was 1934, 1937, before the war, but we're in sort of fascist Italy at that point. He kind of sort of came, he was upset about the fact that his name wasn't on these, like, people are buying these works of art, thinking that they're actually historic works of art. But so we've got also this problem of very, very high quality, sort of museum quality forgeries are a big part of this country as well.
A question here on the Zoom chat. It looks like the Pietra Piana was painted at some point in its history. Do you think it was painted originally? Do you think
I don't recall any descriptions of the work looking like it had been originally polychromed. It seems that it was just an unglazed fired terracotta relief, which we have those. We have examples of those in the Renaissance. Whether or not that they were intended for outdoor tabernacles seems kind of strange to sort of the unglazed terracotta that I think of coming out of the Della Robbia workshop tends to be for indoor spaces. So that's a little funny to me that there doesn't seem to be a history of polychrome on that particular version. but that it was in fact the one that was there. I don't know if it was painted over with a protective layer that was later removed, but it seems that the legibility of the object was obscure enough for this thing to just kind of, be left alone. I think Charles Avery made the first attribution to it being an actual work of Donatello at the same time that they had that last big series of exhibitions in 1986 or 1987. And since then, I think the Italian authorities have accepted that attribution, coming around to 2009, which got the ball moving to purchase the work from the condominium, who had it just basically vaulted up since that attribution had been made. So I'm not sure if it ever had a layer of painting. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Neither way of decorating this terracotta is more common or normal than the other. They did both.
My own personal view to your question, every which way, what do we need another one? It's actually beautiful. Yeah, it's a really, really good terracotta relief, and Donatello probably had something to do with it, and so I think it's a welcome addition in the budget of myself.
I feel a responsibility to our students as well in our afternoon course assignment that, it's like, here's Donatello. Isn't he fantastic? Our job is not to just say, here's Donatello. Our job is to give some inkling of how or why we think something is or is not a Donatello. Don't take it from me. Go, like, that whole column of books there is basically, Renaissance sculpture. Hear what these guys have to say. I put some of the monographs and early catalogs of Donatello on the piano if anyone's interested. But they're also revising this through the discourse of peer-reviewed journal publications. One article says this is Donatello, then another article says, I'd like to challenge that attribution and say this is circle of or workshop of, or I'm going to invent a not name. Who was that guy? Schuring. He invented the Master of the Piccolomini Madonna. Because he said, oh, this looks so much like a Donatello, but it's not quite Donatello. It must be someone that knew him really, really well that we've never heard of before. So let me invent a personality, to give an attribution to this object. That was the way they were doing things back in the 1800s. Connoisseurship, right? Not names, the master of this, the master of that. Who are these people? Maybe these are all the anonymous assistants of Donatello, right? These masters of works that look a lot like Donatello, but maybe not good enough to be an actual Donatello. So this whole hierarchy, of how we give names and attributions to work of art is directly related to that sort of valuation system of the market itself. And the point that I think I failed to make in the presentation was that, for every copy of a Della Robbia or Donatello that Bardini sells to a prince in Liechtenstein or, a state museum in London, or a Gilded Age collector in North America, Boda is writing like the first monograph on Italian Renaissance sculpture. And he's saying this work, this artist, this collection. So now that is not a cause for doubt of the authenticity of the object. It becomes a reaffirmation. Well, of course it's got to be a Donatello because it looks just like all these other Donatellos. Of course it's got to be an original Madonna of Rovezzano, because it looks just like all the other ones. And these things all dropped out of the sky in the second half of the 1800s. If you go to the V&A website, cracks me up. I don't even know why they even have this field of provenance, because nothing got to that place before 1880. You know what I mean? So it's you go to the provenance of any Madonna child, which is described as being Renaissance, Italian, pseudo Donatello, circle of whoever. They did not even see that thing until the second half of the 19th century. So that's the problem with copies in the general discourse of history of art. It's very problematic.
Curacao. Oh.
Thanks, Jeremy. As entertaining as ever. But just on that point of provenance, because obviously this Madonna was on a fairly nondescript 19th century building tabernacle. So how did people rationalize where it was for the previous 4 centuries, and how did it end up on that building?
It's the first thing I think, I'm like, Via Piano. That is okay. It's described as an ancient street. The mayor of Florence, Piero Bargellini, back time of the flood, wrote an extraordinary series, almost like an encyclopedia set called "The Streets of Florence." If you're interested, we've got it right on the back shelf over there. But it's in 4 or 5 volumes, basically, alphabetically. Every via, the, whatever, and he goes, every building, every palace, every what's there. So he mentions the Via Pietrapiana. He talks about the Canto di Nelli, which is the Canto di Nello, which is not the same as the Canto dei Nelli, which is on the other side of town. He goes all through the buildings and says, oh, and there's relief, and he calls it Donatelliana or Robiana. It's sort of Donatello-ish or Robian-ish. It's circle of, he even, like after the war, Bargellini's saying this thing's just like a Bardini leftover, that seems to be the attitude. I would be interested to see when the dimensions of those street corners were actually laid out, because if that's like, Poggi, redoing Florence in the 1800s, was that corner even there in the Renaissance in the way that we find it today? Very likely could have been altered substantially. That tabernacle could have gone onto a building that was only constructed in the. I would look at the urban records, to see how that particular neighborhood was developed, and if there's anything really specific on the maps that show that canto and that intersection changing form over time. We won't have photographs, but you might have descriptions that give you an idea of it being there or not being there before the 19th century.
Well, thanks for yet another great talk. About the Pazzi Madonna, how did it end up in Berlin? Was it bought by Van Bode, or?
Yes.
And are we sure it's a Donatello or a Stefano Bardini version of Donatello?
The Donatello scholars are confident in the attribution to Donatello. The object is mentioned in the correspondence of Stefano Bardini and Willem van Bode. I'm not sure if it comes directly from Florence to Berlin, or if it was brokered for another client of Bode's, and then he sort of manages to get it for Berlin himself. But the idea is what they normally do with these things on Bardini's end is he says, oh, I know the Contessa, up on the hill. She hasn't let anybody in the house for like literally 400 years. And she's letting me go in to see if they've got anything interesting. And this is a really ancient, old, noble Florentine family. The same thing, all of these like Strozzi chairs up in the V&A. Like, okay, you can go to Count Strozzi or whoever it is, but that doesn't mean that it's going to have the same furniture set from 400 years ago that the family ordered. So there's this problem too of like, oh, this came out of the family home of an historical family in the year 1875. But we're calling it Donatello because that family supposedly, commissioned one from Donatello back in that generation. It's as easy as that. You find a really old family with a really old collection, say, oh, wow, look what I found behind the sofa.
Skepticism is fairly evident. Do we have more in the room? More thoughts, questions? Anyone on Zoom want to join in? Nothing much on the chat, but anyone want to unmute and talk to us? Some old friends up there. No, you've all gone quiet tonight. It's all right. Fine. But I think we've run the course of Donatello, and this debate will go on forever. But he was, of course, an outstandingly good sculptor.
And he keeps on giving, obviously.
And,
we're still talking about him.
And there's a lot of that stuff in the Bargello, which for sure he did himself with his workshop. And go over there and enjoy it with the new one. With the new one. Yeah, it's good that he's got a new one. So it's a bit really random, but the Beatles got a new song out last month, so they keep going. All right. So thanks, Jeremy, hugely for that really entertaining lecture. And now thanks Zoomers for being with us, and Sarah put the traditional reminder to make your donations up on the comments. So love to see that happening. Last lecture of the year, so time to catch up. And we'll see you all in January for this, and see those in Florence next week for the concert. And right now, as always, those in the room, there's a glass of wine waiting for you from our season sponsors, Castiglione del Bosco, for the very last time. Thank you.
Merry Christmas, everyone. See you in January.
Merry Christmas.